Okay, so I'm going to start with a brief overview of what we're doing, and then I'm going to turn to the superintendent, and then I'll turn to Dr. Phil. Okay, so reviewing the information for this work session, I kind of had this realization that we're dealing with past, present, and future. That the first presentation we're going to get is a brief overview from the 2012 survey results of kind of where we've been because of that. The majority of the work today is about the 2014 survey results, and that's the majority of what this work session is about. And then as we look to the future and any changes that have to come about for that, we'll be looking to the superintendent for how we deal with that. So I'm going to turn it to Dr. Garza, and then we'll turn it to Phyllis.
Karen. Thank you, Kathy. Yes, I like the way you put that, past, present, and future. And Dr. Pajardo will be touching on some of the work that's been underway over these last 9 to 10 months. We are very sincere in our desire, and I believe we put a lot of effort into developing our working relationship with the teacher organizations. We share the same mission, and we need to work together. With that said, I think we've made great progress. You'll see when you see the working conditions result from January of 2014. We still have some major issues around workload, but primarily around time, and I think primarily around elementary teachers. And I've been talking with folks all throughout this last 9 months, 10 months, and that is a prevailing issue. So we're working on some things. We're just not quite ready to share today. So we're hoping that we'll be able to schedule yet another work session, Chairman Moon, over the next several weeks to talk about what our solutions are moving forward, because we need to address the elementary planning time. We know that's an issue. We need a long-term strategic fix there, and so Mr. Paris and his team have been very helpful, but I apologize, we're just not ready today. We have done some other things, I think, to the extent we can. I also have people say, well, let's take something off the plate, and we're still struggling with what is it that we want to take off the plate. I don't know how much control we have over some of that, but we certainly can do some things around protecting teacher planning time. So we hope to be able to schedule yet another work session in the very near future, maybe over the next couple of weeks or so, because I think some of the decisions around that will have to be, they're kind of time sensitive, and so we'll have to wrestle with some of those over the next couple of weeks or so. So with that being said, that's still a work in progress. We're very interested in how our employees feel about their work, and we know that teaching and serving children is some very, very hard work. So I don't know that we'll ever get to a place where point in time it'll be easy, but we certainly want to do all we can to help mitigate some of that challenge that our teachers feel. So with that said, I think this is going to be continued, and I'll be working with Chairman Moon to get that scheduled over the next couple of weeks or so. So thank you, Kathy.
Hey, thank you so much, Dr. Garza, and good afternoon, board members. It is getting near that time that you just said that the blood doesn't flow, so we hope that that little 5-minute stretch break that you had gives you enough time to give some attention to this topic. We will certainly honor the time that we have been allotted, knowing that you have another session at 4 o'clock as well. So regarding workload, as Dr. Garza already mentioned, I'm just going to give some brief comments about the workload PowerPoint that has been made available to you, so that the bulk of the time this afternoon can be given to New Teacher Center and representatives who are here from New Teacher Center. So last year in April, we met a couple of times to discuss teacher workload. At our April 8th, 2013 session, you agreed to support looking at 3 recommendations around leadership oversight, specific working condition standards, and school-level support around working conditions. We have continued that work, and so in the PowerPoint, you're going to see an update of each of those areas as well. When we met again in late April of last year, there were a few other items where we agreed to continue the conversation. That was around district assessments, planning time, and teacher evaluation. So in this PowerPoint, you will see the recommendations that were agreed upon and then an update for each of those 6 areas as well. And then, as Dr. Garza said, we will tell you and talk with you a little bit more about teacher workload once, in fact, that session is scheduled. So that's all on workload as well for this afternoon. Regarding so you can actually pull that down and get to the working conditions piece. Today we have with us from New Teacher Center, Eric Hirsch, who is the Chief Officer of External Affairs. Eric has been with us now, I think, through 4 iterations of the Working Conditions Survey, which is a national assessment. We also have with us Andrew Seiberg, who is the Director of Teaching and Learning Conditions for New Teacher Center. And I know that I've worked with Andrew at least for 2 iterations of the Working Conditions Survey. We also have in the audience various members of our Working Conditions Survey Action Team. We have some of our association presidents and members who are on that work team. I see Marty Smith over as a cluster assistant superintendent who's on that survey action team. We have staff from Human Resources. I'd like to recognize Beth Boyven, who is a specialist working in human resources. You may remember that last year, with your commitment to this, and as I came back to you and said, we actually need some dedicated resources to work in this area. So Beth is on a 2-year special project to certainly deliver better follow-up with working conditions. She's also has a deliverable of helping us see through the working condition standards to be set by the division as well, so we can know what's the appropriate range. She's also doing some work through the HR operational expectations on an exit survey for staff, as well as investigating the working condition survey for support staff. So we thank those members of the action team who are here today, and thank you for working along with us. So, Eric, I'm going to turn this over to you, and Andrew, and welcome back. We're glad to have your expertise here at the table, and take it away.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having us. There we go. Thank you for having us again. See if we're on first name basis. I'm Eric. It's been so great to work with Phyllis and her phenomenal team with Beth back there and everyone else for what is now our 4th iteration of the Fairfax County Public Schools Teacher Working Conditions Survey. And I know I got to see many of you last year. So again, this has been now our 4th iteration. We do this survey biennially, so every other year, in part because it's a real heavy lift to hear from 13,000 educators. We've also learned from our research that the results are relatively stable across schools. Certainly changes in leadership, other factors may influence these conditions, and we'll talk about some of those. But ultimately, we feel like every other year gives us time to assess the conditions, or collectively to really think through at the school level how to utilize these results for school improvement planning, and to actually give time for some of those changes that are happening in the conditions to really take place. We assess 9 areas of teaching conditions: time, facilities and resources, managing student conduct, community engagement and support, teacher leadership, school leadership, professional development, and instructional practices and support. We're not going to go through every one of those areas today because it would truly be mind-numbing to walk through what is ultimately about 150 different questions across these 8 constructs here in the district. So we're going to focus on a few of these constructs a little bit more in depth and really try to focus on how things have changed Okay? The survey, as Phyllis said, is a national survey in that we've been doing this at the New Teacher Center for a while. We have heard from actually, now that we hit 250,000 educators just this year. Thank you for your 13,000 educator contribution. We've now heard from 1.25 million educators over the past 7 years across 15 states and 27 districts, trying to gather data such as this, and again, really try to get information in the hands of phenomenal educators, district administrators, and school board members to really ensure that educators are given the best chance of success to do right by kids by giving them the conditions and support they need. The survey is externally validated. We did that as part of the Bill and Melinda Gates Measures of Effective Teaching Foundation, and we work hard to make sure your specific questions, because we've been asking a lot of questions specific to the district, have also been validated along with our constructs. Okay? So why do you keep having us back? I know it is not my charming personality. I know on occasion it's to see how much thicker my glasses are getting. I actually had the wireframes when we started, but they've gotten bigger and bigger, I think, with more and more lines of survey data. But ultimately, we wanted to share the reason we're here, and the reason you keep bringing us back is to remind you that it really does matter for kids. Ultimately, as I said, for teachers to do their best work, these conditions that we assess ultimately make a difference. They can either catalyze or constrain effective teaching. And so you can see here a couple different data points that come from us at the New Teacher Center. One is a forthcoming book chapter that I wrote with Ron Ferguson from Harvard that's coming out as part of this Gates Met study, which actually directly ties the conditions that we assess in this survey to value-added gain scores in 7 districts across the country. Okay? And what we found in particular is time, which I know we're going to discuss a lot today and the district has discussed quite a bit. Empowerment, professional development, and managing student conduct are real teacher enablers. These are the conditions that can really unpack the best teaching from teachers and those supports. And those are correlated with the other conditions we measure. There was just, in addition, a recent study that looked at a decade's worth of data from Charlotte-Mecklenburg, down in our neck of the woods, down in North Carolina, for over a decade. They looked at value-added gain scores from the district over the decade, and because we've done the survey now 7 times in North Carolina since 2002, they looked at a decade of our data. They took 24 of the same questions we asked here in Fairfax, and I believe the statistical term is they mushed them together into a single construct and said, let's look at teachers in schools that have great conditions and let's look at teachers in schools that have lesser conditions. And what they found is teachers, similar teachers, improved their effectiveness 38% over a decade in schools that had the top conditions compared to the lower conditions. Ultimately, school context matters. Teachers in schools that have these supportive environments are better able to do their best work. Doesn't guarantee success, nor do more challenging conditions necessarily constrain our teachers as individuals. But overall, we know these things make a difference for kids and for keeping teachers. Okay? So with that, let's celebrate some successes here, because your working conditions have remained stable, and that is a great thing because your working conditions are very, very positive. Not just generally for Fairfax County and because so many educators report these, but we're going to show you a little bit of comparison to other districts as well. But first, know that when we show you this data, this is an accumulation of your most precious resources, your educators that work with the children you serve. And we heard from, again, 13,752. So more than 4 out of 5 educators responded. You can see here that's almost 12,000 teachers, 180 principals, which is fantastic. Again, this is a survey of all school-based licensed educators. Okay? And you can see the other groups that we heard from, and that's up from 2012. Okay? And someday, do I need to aim? There we go. First point we'd like to make to you, again, is conditions are stable. These teaching conditions we assess were very positive to begin with, and they remain positive, despite a whole lot of things going on at the local and state context in which you work. So looking in particular, overall the school leadership in my school is effective. 4 out of 5 educators agree that's up. Overall, my school is a good place to work and learn. Almost 9 out of 10 educators agree with that statement in Fairfax County Public Schools. Teachers are held to high professional standards for delivering instruction. 94% of educators agree with that statement. And the faculty work in a school environment that's safe. 96%. So again, you can see they've gone up. On the average question, if we smush all the questions together, stable, but went up about 0.2% in if you mushed agree and strongly agree together. So again, as you look across the district, things have remained relatively stable. Let's talk a little bit within those 8 constructs about where things have improved and some of the challenges that still remain for the district. Okay? So first off, I think where one of the gains we wanted to point out that I think is really important is the job that school leadership is doing. What you see here are the percentage of educators who agree or strongly agree that school leadership makes a sustained effort to address any teacher concerns across the areas that we assess on these constructs. And what you can see here is 9 out of 10 agreement on community support and involvement, all the way down. In every one of these areas, including the use of time in my school, 3/4 or more of the educators in the district agree that there are sustained efforts to address their concerns. And in every single one of those areas, which you can see the difference between 2012 and 2014, educators are more positive. There is more being done across the district by school leadership within individual schools to address some of these issues. Okay? And when we say school leadership, I want to be clear, we actually define that on the survey. That is inclusive of the principal, but not exclusive to the principal. So we actually define it as any individual, group, or team that make fundamental decisions about the direction of the school. Okay? So this is a testament not just to the school leadership, but all the efforts we know the district are making around teacher leadership and looking at leadership as a whole in the building. Okay? You can see other gains, which we think are strongly connected with some of the things school leadership does. Efforts are made to reduce the amount of routine administrative paperwork. 2/3 agree with that in 2014, up almost 4%. There's an atmosphere of trust and mutual respect in the school. We'll talk about that a couple times throughout the presentation. Almost 4 out of 5 agree. Teachers are protected from duties. School administrators support teachers' efforts to maintain discipline in the classroom, and school leadership effectively communicates policies. Again, at least 3/4 agreement on all of those questions except for the routine paperwork. Okay? With me so far? And keep driving. Okay? Let me try to put the data in perspective a little bit. So again, we do this survey statewide in Maryland. We did not do the survey in Maryland this year. We did it last year, which is why it says 2013. So we pulled Baltimore City, Prince George's, Baltimore County. And you can see Jefferson County, which is right outside of Denver, about 160 schools in Jefferson County. I pulled 2 districts this year for North Carolina. One is Wake County and one is Charlotte, but that data will not be released until Friday of this week, so I cannot tell you which is which. But both are excellent comparisons. And then what you see is Hillsborough, Florida, which is Tampa, okay, which is the 6th largest district. Or no, that's Broward. They are in the top 10. All right? And again, if you look at some of these school leadership indicators, and again, this is the rate of agreement and strongly agree across the entire district on these questions, you can see Fairfax does very, very well around having a shared vision. There's that atmosphere of trust and mutual question, which matters so much to whether educators stay, and you can see higher than in any of these comparable districts. Teachers feel comfortable raising issues more than any other districts. School leadership consistently supports districts. Again, some really strong results across the board on school leadership. Okay? One of the areas, aside from time, that has changed a bit in Fairfax is around professional development and support and learning for your teachers. And what you see here is there are a few areas here where things went down, So under professional development being evaluated, went from 2/3 about in 2012 down to under 6 out of 10 in 2014. Professional development offerings being data-driven. Professional development deepening teachers' knowledge and providing skills on through. We saw a decline. Again, not steep declines. So again, we're looking at 3-4%, but some declines that we thought we would bring to your attention. As we tried to unpack this a little bit more, we tried to figure out why might this be the case. And I think one of our hypotheses and one of the other things we saw in the data are that teachers are reporting being less engaged in decision making within their school building in a variety of areas. And the one with the greatest decline has been determining the content of in-service professional development programs. Down from 6 out of 10 saying that teachers play a moderate or large role, down to 53%. Okay? So one is making sure professional development is really individualized to meet the needs of educators in that school. And again, part of that is making sure they are engaged in those areas. Okay? And you could see some dips around a variety of decisions in these areas. That said, one thing to note is more educators report, despite those trends, having professional development across the board in 2014 than 2012. So what you see here are the percentage of teachers only who reported having 10+ hours of professional development over the past 2 years in these areas. Okay? So one is to look and see that you're under 50% in several areas. Okay? Around really differentiating instruction to diverse learners, from the English language learners to gifted on down. But you can see in all of these areas a greater percentage of teachers having access to professional development. So again, we see a decline, small decline in professional development. Part of that seems to be driven by the role teachers are playing in selecting opportunities that meet their needs. But we do see that we are keeping up and, in fact, accelerating the amount of opportunities available to teachers in the district. Okay? I also want to note how positive these results, even though they have declined, are to comparison districts. So again, looking at some of our, I apologize, that says school leadership questions, professional development questions, along the left-hand side. You can see where Fairfax County is across all the comps. This is an area in which we have been working directly with Hillsborough for quite a few years now, with a full-time release induction model and a lot of in-school support. So you see only Hillsborough comes close to where Fairfax is on some of these professional development questions. Okay. The one other area I wanted to call to your attention before just raising a couple last points and getting in a discussion or entertaining questions. Okay. Okay, just making sure. Okay. I can do it. I can stop. Okay. Is community. There we go. Well, and for discussion. So let me get out of the way and let's get into that discussion. What you can see here is I really want to bring up knowing how important engaging the community is to your efforts on the school board, and to share what educators said. And this is an area where Fairfax County Public Schools shines compared to any of the other comparable districts around engaging the community, two-way communication, parents and guardians knowing what's going on in their school, et cetera. And so again, you can see the results across some similar districts in Maryland on through. Okay, so the last piece, two things here. Number one, I presented you with district averages. I was in front of the governor of North Carolina once going through the results, and he called me a statistician, which really hurt. Really hurt. And he said, you know, statisticians, they're the kind of people who say your feet are in the freezer and your head is in the oven, but overall you're doing fine. We want to make sure this is not the case in Fairfax County. So what you have here is a graphic where we can start and look at, do we have any schools in the freezer and any schools in the oven? Okay? In this case, the oven's good, right? Because we're really trying to look at who are really beating those averages of the district so we can learn from them. You have the answers to so many of the questions here in the district with some phenomenal schools with great conditions. What you see on the top, let me go through the horizontal dash line that's set at 83%. That is the district average rate of agreement to a single question on the survey. So again, take a breath. In that we ask about 150 questions. The average agreement rate about whether a research-based positive condition is in place for them to do their job, 4 out of 5 agree. So that hash across a horizontal is the district average if you smushed all the questions together. The vertical line is growth on the survey between 2012 and 2014. If you're to the right, you grew. If you're to the left, you declined. And the red hash actually matches the zero black line, because remember, the average growth was 0.2, okay? So what you see is if you go to the top left quadrant, you see schools that are above the district average, but they have declined since 2012. So these are schools with better than average conditions, but they're trending in a direction we want to keep our eyes on, okay? What you see to the top right quadrant are schools that are above average and have improved. These are the schools we really want to learn from. They're trending right, they're above average, and you'll notice that, as we affectionately call them, you can either call them SpaghettiOs or Fruit Loops. By color, blue are elementary, orange is high school, green are middle schools, okay? And you can imagine the average conditions in an elementary school tend to be more positive than a middle school or a high school, so that's why you tend to see more of the blue up, okay? But you'll notice that in that top quadrant, you can find high schools, middle schools, and elementary schools. You can find schools at all levels above average and growing. Bottom right-hand quadrant, these are another set of schools to keep our eyes on. They're below district average, but they're trending in the right way. Okay? So these are folks we want to understand what policies have you put in place, and let's make sure and give them time to work, because we hope in 2016 to see some continued progress and get you up to that average. Okay? Bottom left. There's the freezer. Okay? So what we want to look at bottom left are schools that have declined and are below average. Okay? Now remember, because we're setting this at the average, you are always going to see a set of Fruit Loops that are below that red hash line that's set at a very high 83%. But you can see down some of these schools here are pretty far off from the district average. They're at 65, as low as 52% on aggregate, okay, on through. So the key piece here is all this data is up and available. There's so much going on with the district. And ultimately, it's really saying, how can we learn from those on the top right and really apply some of these practices that may work in these contexts in the bottom left. To put this in another graphic way, if you break out the number of schools, and this is, if you look at the green, these are the percentage of schools in each construct, so we broke them back out to the 8. The green means they were between 5% increase or decrease, so they're pretty stable. The blue are the number of schools in which fewer than 5% decline. Okay? Actually, that'd be greater than, my apologies. And then the 18 schools where there was a greater than 5%. So if you look at time, for example, 69 schools stayed relatively stable. 61 declined by 5% or more, and 64 went up 5% or more. So again, graphically, we're trying to show you facilities and resources, community support, instructional practices stayed very similar. We see a lot more of the differences school to school in the areas of time in particular between 2012 and 2014. Okay? So when you start to look, we can see there are schools that are stable, there are schools that have declined, and schools that have increased. So again, let's unpack the data and really break it out down to the cluster and down to the school. Last piece of why it's important, we showed you that atmosphere of trust that's at almost 80%. Okay? What you see on the left are the percentage. These are people we call stayers. This is teachers who say, I want to stay in this building into the foreseeable future as long as I can. I plan to remain teaching in the classroom. The next column you see are people who want to move. These are teachers who on our survey said, I want to keep teaching, but not at the building I'm at. Okay? The next column are people who want to leave the classroom to go into administration, to do other things in education. And then the final column are those who say, I want to leave education altogether. Ignore those last two columns for a second because they have a real distinct grouping, right? Those who want to be principals may be working in schools with great conditions or not. They just may want to be able to do different things to impact students and teachers differently. And then those who leave education are people who are also retiring from schools with great conditions. So let's focus for a second on stayer versus mover. What you see in the cell are the percentage agreement and strongly agree in those areas. So let me read through it, and I think it might answer your question because I can tell, okay? So 82.8% of those who say they want to stay in their classroom agree that there's an atmosphere of trust and mutual respect. Only 37.7% of those who want to move agree that there's an atmosphere of trust and mutual respect. So stayers are more than twice as likely to report that there's trust in their building. And what we did is we unpacked the questions from those with the greatest differences between stayers and movers. So again, you can see teachers feel comfortable raising issues and concerns that are important to them. Only a third of movers say that's true in their school, compared to over 3/4 of stayers. Making a little more sense? One of the most interesting things here is look at the question with the second greatest difference between stayers and movers. At this school, we utilize the results from the 2012 survey as a tool for school improvement. Okay? Stayers, much more likely, more than any question but trust, to agree with that. And that's not because we think there's some magic in a single data point. But think about what it takes to actually pick up data, which is a reflection of teacher voice, and talk about it within your school and within your building. The kind of trust that takes, the kind of motion forward, if you are really legitimately using it for school improvement. This is a proxy for a lot of great things going on in the school about school leadership, data, etc. And as Phyllis said, there's a lot going on that we've been working on and a lot into the future that we'll do to make sure when we ask that question in 2014, it's 100% agreement rate. Okay? You can get the data at this website for any school. It is up and public at this point in time. And with that, spitballs welcome.
Okay, I have Elizabeth first.
Can we go back to that last slide for a second? Because I have a clarification question before we do anything else.
This one
No,
or the data one?
The data one.
Yep.
What's, for example, what's the 71.0 in the middle?
So that would be 71% of your teachers who said, I want to leave the classroom, agreed with that statement, okay? So the reason you see that being pretty close to the stayers is, why would somebody leave the classroom but stay in education? They may or may not have those positive conditions. They want to do more, right? They want to go into the principalship. They want to go into central administration. They want to do other things. So again, that is a category of teachers who said, if I had to best guess what I'm going to do next year, there are people who say, I'm going to stay in education, but not as a classroom
Okay, well,
teacher.
that's kind of common sense. My question is, what's the percentage that want to leave the classroom?
So of respondents, it is about 5% of our total population.
So only 5% were saying that they wanted to leave the classroom.
Correct. I will actually pull that up and give you the exact amount to make sure. Okay. 82% of teachers, and this is a teacher-only question, say they want to continue teaching at their current school. Okay, so 4 out of 5. 7% say they want to continue teaching in this district but leave that school. 2%, and we combine those for that mover category, say they want to continue teaching in this state but leave the district. So 9%, about 1 out of 10 teachers say, I want to teach, but not where I'm teaching at. And that's why, again, this is kind of, when we think of it from a human resources standpoint, this is a valuable commodity, right? These are people we're going to have to replace, and maybe if we could do more, in particular in these areas which seem to be the drivers for them, particularly around school leadership, we wouldn't have the churn and the flux. And some churn and flux is good. It's necessary, right? Just like unemployment rates, we don't ever expect we'll get to 0, right?
Okay, if we can go back, it's hard on which slide here because it's a question of the page number, but where we're comparing the districts. So on my PDF, it's 8 out of 18.
If you just tell me the
that one, that's fine. So my question is, knowing what our surrounding jurisdictions are, how are these peer districts? I'm trying to figure out. I mean, I don't know that we ever talk about Baltimore County. I don't know that we ever talk about Prince George's. Mm-hmm. We certainly don't talk about Baltimore City. I mean, I'm just trying to figure out how we're, quote unquote, doing very well compared to why these districts.
It's a wonderful question. And the why is in part, where have I been, right? So it's who are our clients, right? So for example, I do not do the survey in California statewide, so I would not be able to pull up data from any California districts. We do the survey in Maryland. I know you compare often to Montgomery County. When we did the statewide administration in Maryland, Montgomery County's response rate was about 30% compared to your 82%. So I wanted to use, yes ma'am, statewide administrations, our overall response rate was about 60% in Maryland, but we really lagged in Montgomery County. And there may be lots of reasons for that. They may do their own survey, right? When we do this statewide, which is where we do this mostly, so we surveyed all districts in Colorado. We got a great response rate in Jefferson County. We had a lot of buy-in in the leadership. I don't have Denver County up there for you because Denver County, we only received a lesser one. So I pulled these. What we looked at was size. We didn't want to compare you to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and there's 7 schools. We looked at urbanicity, and we looked at free and reduced lunch count. And these were the best size-wise comparisons to places where you may know. So I think the key piece here is, one, let's look at the data on its own merits as well. 4 out of 5 agreeing, 2/3, and reflect on what that means. I think also we just wanted, when you go to the eye doctor, right, and they say A, B, A, B, to try to help put the data in
appreciate that
context.
observation, but, in context to what the dialogue is within the district, within the community, that occurs within, our everything from our Board of Supervisors discussions to, what happens with, parent and stakeholder groups. Whether or not our teachers are doing well compared to teachers in Hillsborough, Florida, doesn't mean a hill of beans, because that's not where our teachers are going to go if there's a problem. Our teachers are, I want to know how they're doing in Loudoun, Prince William, Arlington, Alexandria, Montgomery County. Yes, Montgomery County. Not so much Prince George. So, that, having, I don't know, I feel like a little bit I'm having to evaluate, yes, ethereally, this is very, this is kind of a big picture thing, is, almost like on a nationwide, but how relevant is it to the facts on the ground here? And then when I see roll-ups to division-wide, that concerns me, because I think that the most meaningful data graph is the access graph. Can we go back to the access graph? And looking, this is us. This is, now granted, this is us compared to others, but it's also us over time.
No, this is you compared to you from 2012.
Compared to us from 2012. But
Yes, ma'am.
statistically based on how other divisions do, or no? Just purely us. So this one, it seems like all of our time should be spent, in terms of what's meaningful to the board. This is where the important data points are. And when I look at the number of orange that are below the line, and worse yet, in the lower left, now you're like, where does the board spend its time? Where do we meaningfully spend our time? And the disproportionate number of orange below the line, and certainly to the lower left quadrant, is, I think, should be the focus of what we're talking about. I mean, it's almost more to my colleagues than it is to you, but on a going forward basis in terms of what our measure is, meaningfully measuring ourselves against others, how we're performing against Baltimore City.
Well, remember,
a little tiny bit don't care.
I actually asked for that because there's no context for, Eric can tell me we're at 90% on something. 90% compared to what? You have to have some context for it. Now, I get your point. How much do you make of it? Because we really are, you just want to know how you're trending compared to other comparably sized school systems with similar demographics.
Right.
But it's not the whole picture. I agree with you. Then we have to dig in deeply with, what do we need to do better in terms of our division standard. But I think there is some merit to knowing, how, what is the context and what is it relative to?
Okay, as long as it's put in that light, I agree that knowing, kind of for context, for interest's sake, if you have a similar sized district somewhere, there aren't that many who have similar demographics, there aren't that many. If you go out to those and understanding it in context, I get it, but I still feel like a disproportionate amount of the report should be on the drill down, not at division-wide averages, because everything looks great when you average over, a school district our size. It's super. Everything's super. We don't fall below the line once you blend everything together.
And
the
to that
problem is,
point,
that's not so much blended on that screen.
right? And to that point, that's where staff has spent most of our time. Okay. In fact, I haven't looked at the division-wide averages since the last time you presented to us.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not offended, Dr. Carroll.
Okay, I'm sorry to hurt
Well,
your feelings.
And in part, these are really great points and great questions. And again, as I said, we are captive for comparisons to places where NTC gathers data. But for this, I think you're right on. And the thing I glossed over very quickly, as I know you did as well, Phyllis, because we wanted to be attentive to time. There has been a tremendous amount of work done by the cluster area superintendents and working within the principals, the rollout to school teams where we trained almost 350 people to unpack the data so they could answer this really good question that you said, which is, why are we down here? What does it mean? What does it mean to say 2/3 of us trust each other? Well, that in a middle school means something very different if it's the entire 6th grade is your third, or if they're scattered throughout the building, or if they're in the core content areas versus itinerant teachers, and to make
that's where I
meaning.
think
So
that's where I think a report to the board needs to focus, is that, and the bar graph on slide 15 or 15 of 18, where you have the difference of overtime. Can we go to that one?
Sure.
This one. These two are about what's happening here. Now, you have the snippet about the context, and others. But this is, to me, this report should be, okay, what do you need to worry about? What are you doing well? What do you need to watch? And what are you not doing well? And I don't feel like I got that exactly from the report, but I can drill down to look for it. And maybe that's more an offline conversation, or... Yes. And where's the concern? Where does this highlight, not at a division, not overall, but where is it that we've got the issues? And then how is that going to affect us in terms of decisions we've got to make to fix it?
Let me just add something for a little bit. I do know that 2 years ago, by comparison to Fairfax County and other Virginia districts. So, and Ms. Hines was on a committee working with Virginia around, would Virginia actually implement a working condition survey and engage New Teacher Center. And I believe Steve Greenberg was also on a committee that worked on that. I'll find out what the status of that, because if that happens, then we will have local comparisons as well as comparisons around the Commonwealth. As it relates to the higher number of high schools below the line, I think I heard you say, Eric, that generally, as you administer the survey and have the results, that elementary schools are more positive and high schools overall, not just in FCPS, are less.
Absolutely, which is why if you go to the FCPS WCS, which is the hardest acronym to get out, that ultimately we compare schools to, again, give the comparative lens. Here's you compared to other schools at your level, as well as compared to other schools in the district. Because again, you can think of a variety of reasons why an elementary school around community engagement. I have a 10-year-old and a 13-year-old. My 10-year-old school is the children are much cuter and easier to read to than those at the middle school level, on through managing student conduct. So many of the things we assess, and they're all important, and they're all important at the appropriate level, but you can imagine how the issues are different at those levels. So we do see orange more likely to be below average, but you're, again, still bringing up a wonderful point, which is, what is it about those in the bottom left compared to, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 high schools that are in that top quadrant that are above the average, which is predominantly elementary schools. What can we learn from them and celebrate? But really then, what is our collective step to bring it to those preponderance in the orange Fruit Loops?
Thank you. I have Sandy, Il-Young, then Ted.
Thanks very much for this report. There's a lot of meaty information in there. Could you go back to 15 for a minute? I just want to make sure I'm understanding what this is telling me. I think it was page 15, the one with that Elizabeth's just asking. Not that one. The bar,
Yeah.
that one. So just giving time as an example, what are we seeing here? That 69 are
So 60,
yeah,
you
go
bet.
ahead.
And my apologies, because there is a wrong metric in that.
Okay.
So 69 schools, the one in the Kelly Green,
All right.
are schools that are stable between 2012 and 2014. So in 70 schools in the district, roughly, right, 69, you had teaching conditions in the smushed average of time, roughly 8 questions composited together,
Right.
did not move more than 5%. Okay? So these are virtually the same results. If you look to the left, you see 61 schools, okay, that they declined. Okay?
So they got worse.
5%
They got worse
more. They
by
got
more
worse
than
in the area of
Okay.
time, which are things
All
like some of the workload questions, planning time, collaborative time, class
Right.
size, et cetera. Then 64 of those schools increased. So 2 things to take away.
Okay.
Again, this is a campus by campus conversation.
Right.
And the other thing is, some of these conditions are much more stable than others.
Okay.
You're doing great on facilities and resources, community engagement, et cetera. Managing student conduct was very stable in there as well.
Okay.
The time issue really does differ significantly, and there were ebbs
Right.
and flows very different when you get down to the
Okay.
school level.
I appreciate that clarification. And, following up on what Ms. Schultz said, I appreciate you telling us why not Montgomery County. So can we assume that you haven't done this in Arlington and Loudoun and Prince William, and that's why we're not seeing a comparison there?
Correct. The only other district we work with in Virginia is we are now doing a little bit of work with the Alexandria City Public Schools.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And that data is not yet public.
Oh, okay. So I guess, when I looked throughout this, it seems like there are a couple of takeaways that we can look at, and one is with the professional development piece. That seems to be an area for improvement, and I think we're working on that. Dr. Garza, did you want to tell us anything about that you wanted to share? Karen, I should.
And Karen, before you say something about that, let me offer some context, just as Eric offered context to the school leadership question. as it relates to professional development, it's important to know, as he said, that this could be about professional development happening at the school level, at the district level, teachers actually taking courses outside of the division. I think when I looked at the PD construct, it says in-services, workshops, courses. It's about 5 or 6 things. So if you will take a minute, since was I incorrect in that, or is that correct? To give context of PD.
So we ask about professional development at your school, but it is provider agnostic, right? So absolutely, it could be if somebody, and again, it's hard, it's a perceptual survey, and there are great strengths and great limitations to that. So you're absolutely correct in that they could be taking a course at George Mason and hate it and attribute that to their school.
Right. And so I guess one of the things we do hear from teachers is that they want more input into which professional development they get. They don't want that handed down to them they want more input into that. So I think that this does substantiate that desire. And in the same vein, the other 2 pieces that I pulled out from this was on teacher input on school improvement planning, as well as teacher input on student discipline. And that seems to be 2 areas where they're telling us they really feel that they would like to have more input into the school improvement plans, as well as in student discipline procedures. So I wanted to highlight those because when I look at this, those are something right there, 63.7%. It's not so much that it was a big reduction from before, but still, for teachers to feel that they're not as engaged in that area, as well as in the school improvement plan. Would you agree or disagree with that statement, that those were areas where we might want to look at those and improve?
I think absolutely. You note some areas. You can see the closer the decision is to what teachers tend to do, right, which is plan, grade, and provide instruction, the greater role teachers are playing. That's fantastic. We are not making normative judgments per se that teachers should play 100% moderate or large role. Some of these, if you asked a teacher, they'd say, oh my gosh, we don't have enough time to do right? This is part of the workload, as I think you would all mention, what else are we taking off the plate? So we are merely presenting this in some ways to say, here, school by school, is where teachers do feel engaged. There is a question which asks about do teachers play an appropriate role in decision-making at the school, which can accompany these, which I think can lead to really healthy dialogue about how are teachers engaged, and is this sufficient, and getting their right expertise at the school as well as district level.
I mean, I look at places with lower numbers, school budget and selection of teachers, but that's not an area where I would expect teachers to be involved, as opposed to the others. Karen, did you have something?
I get, when I look at these kinds of questions, what I reflect upon, and I don't know if it's accurate or not in terms of what you're finding, is it relates to communication. Okay? So you go to a school where you have a very effective principal, and he or she has a process for selection of new teachers, but not everybody can be on the committee. But they make a concerted effort to say, I'm having this committee, so-and-so has, these 3 or 4 people have been selected to represent teachers at this school. So it's in some cases, I think it's about clarity around communication and improvement in communication. Budget, I think, is the same way. School improvement planning is the same way. If you're really good at communicating what's going on at school, that people feel like that they've been a part of. Do you find that to be true? And I see Phyllis, I don't know, you may want to comment on that too.
I agree with what you said. In these processes, people are involved. It just generally isn't everyone is involved. There are from my cluster days, there are school teachers who are on the school improvement committee. They are represented by different grade levels and/or different content areas as well. And as a cluster assistant superintendent, I was always looking for the involvement of that stakeholder, and that it was not happening in a vacuum. As it relates to the selection of teachers, the same thing. We just recently had transfer, where our teachers who are currently in the division interview with schools as they are looking to move, to transfer. There were school teams who were there who had teachers at the table with an administrator interviewing.
So-
And I'm not pointing to the selection of teachers
Okay.
new to the
Because you're
school
just
as an
saying yourself,
area,
yeah.
because I wouldn't
agree.
expect that to
Right.
be an area of major. I wouldn't expect that. Maybe I'm wrong, but I would expect the teachers to be involved in establishing student discipline procedures, for example. And I would expect, I would hope that a high level, and particularly in school improvement planning, I would think that that would be another area where a high level of teachers felt directly engaged in that process.
And I
that's
think
fine.
that a great question and comment. So let me clarify the way we ask the question, which is not whether you as an individual participate. It's whether teachers, and we define teachers on the survey overall as a majority of teachers in the building. It's not every teacher. It's not you and your best friend or you. It's a majority of teachers in the building. So this really is a very important point, right? So there may be teachers engaged through a committee process. I think that often does occur. And this is why this is not about a principal per se, it's about the building. We always say the unit of analysis of our survey is the school. These are school conditions. It takes a community to create them and to improve them. And so ultimately, if that teacher is not communicating back as a committee member to the other faculty, teachers may perceive they're not involved. So it's sometimes communication, but it's also about empowerment. And I think you're coming on to something here, right? So if we say 75% of educators agree that teachers play a moderate or large role, that means 25% say teachers are playing a small role or no role at all.
Right.
And if you come back, that's 4,000 educators who we would estimate touch, roughly 40,000 children or so, potentially in the district. So I think this is a really important point to try to unpack percentages, which is why we try to provide that those columns, but also to get into some of those real numbers, because 75% is very good. And maybe some teachers are there, but the overall perception, through a quarter of folks are saying teachers are not playing that role. So really trying to gather more information school by school about how decisions are made. And we know that the cluster area superintendents and the school improvement teams are really working to unpack that and come up with structures that make sense.
Thank you.
Il-Young, Ted, then Megan.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. I have a few clarifying questions, and I can start from this particular chart. That when I'm going to look at the top numbers right there, 53.1 going to 59.8. There was considered to be a difference of 6.7, simply subtracting the numbers, correct?
As an aggregate percentage of the full group that responded in 2012.
Absolutely,
compared to
absolutely.
2014.
Is that the way? Is for this is 15, slide number 15. If you go to slide number 15,
Got it?
so when you had 5% increase or decrease, is the same as you did, or
So
I'm trying to understand what you did.
And again, great questions. And when we try to scale up and really put a lot of content on a slide, it's very hard to try to get that out. And these are great questions. So this is that within a single school, that faculty, so if there were 110 people at Fairfax High School in 2012, that 73% agreed across the time questions in 2012. Okay? In 2014, if however many respondents, be there 98, whatever, if that same percentage was, let's say, 76%, they would fall in the Kelly Green category.
Okay.
If that same percentage at that building were 95%, they would fall in the dark green that they improved. And if it were 62%, they would be a school that would go in there.
Okay, that helps me to better understand your numbers, because sometimes people may think, for example, if a school changed from, let's say, 50% to 45%, whether that was going to be considered 5% change, or since there's 5%, 5 out of 50, whether that's a 10%.
Correct. 5% for the aggregate agreement rate.
Okay, so
And
that's how you
need
did
to
for all of
create
these
some
numbers.
Good footnotes for you on the slides.
Okay,
great
and so
question.
if you consider, because I think from this page, this slide, you consider 5% to be stable, relatively stable. And I'm trying to go back to slide number 10. Where whenever I see negative numbers, naturally as a board member, I have a concern. Negative being it's going not the positive direction. That would you consider 5% change, the difference there to be 5% or less to be stable?
To a degree, I think part of this is the different population size that we are surveying. So when we look across the district, we're looking at basically a change with an N of 13,000, between 12,500 and 13,000. When we're looking at it within a school, it is a much smaller population, which, one, it creates much greater swings, as you can imagine. So the 5% is, to a degree, arbitrary, in that we're trying to give you data that says, let's try to divvy up the schools. If it's within 5%, you can imagine 5% is very different in a small elementary school than it would be at my mythical high school of 110 people.
So it could be just one person versus when you have a larger pool.
Right.
That 1% change could mean a lot.
Which is why certainly noting the difference when we're looking at schools and when we're looking at the district as a whole is important. So if we see a 5% change, let's go back to the raw numbers, that could mean roughly in Fairfax about 900, 800 people changing agreement. Now, of course, I'd assume the same people answered, right? So that could be hundreds, if not 1,000 people here, compared to at a school level where it could be 1 or 2 people leaving. So again, we've tried to set these marks. We're trying to show you the differences. And part of what we hope is the board will have continued conversations, as we know the district is and the school are, in trying to make meaning for why those changes occurred and what these changes may mean around teaching practice.
Okay, thank you. Just one last question. Again, by the way, great presentation. Thank you for the data. Very enlightening for me personally as one board member. With going to small size font, scattergram or scatter plot.
The Fruit Loops, yeah.
Thank you. Since on this plot, we are just trying to see our schools within the division against each other. Going forward, will be always something like this. Schools in 4 different quadrants, more or less, similar portion as that. Because there will always be schools below average, above average, up and down, or left and right.
Absolutely, which is why noting where that red hash line is for the district average, which is your district average for 2014 rate of agreement, is an important thing to look at as well, right? So looking at this, absolutely, some schools, if it is an average, will be above and below, and talking about where that average is and how that average moves. Which is why one of the first things we talked about is it was stable. It was 0.2%. So that red hash line stayed roughly the same. So now looking at whether this school, right, grew, let's say here were those confidence kind of intervals that we set below, around what we said it's relatively stable. If you're in here, right, this is the less than 5% change in the more than 5% change, right? If we drew goalposts there, we're kicking a large majority of your schools through the goalposts that they have very stable conditions if you take that 5% or below. So again, you're right, and part of what we've really done a great job with Beth and with Phyllis and with Dr. Garza, thank you, is to say, let's look at these that are at 10, 15, and 20, and 25% at the school level, and below 20, 15, et cetera. So again, I think looking at the outliers can be helpful, because the way we're going to improve with such a high average is to really try to tackle those outliers.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to just take one more. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. I mean, I think one of the really important points to make at this individual school level is these data points are not telling you what's working and what's not working at the school level. And so we really have to dig down to the individual school level, because in the most challenging conditions that we're presenting here, what you're not seeing is there is world-class teaching going on in the most challenging school settings. And conversely, it doesn't mean that the schools with the highest or most positive conditions don't have skeletons in their closet, right? So really the conversations, these data points are starting points to unpack what's working and what's not working down at the individual school level, to really understand where those supports are needed and where things are stable. So this, I think, is a starting point for conversations as well.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to just ask you just one more question. Okay, next time around. Thank you, Mrs. Smith.
We can't be held responsible for how long our answers are to his very succinct question.
Finish.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right, thank you, Mrs. Smith. Because I'm going to a professional development program where we have seen numbers indicating that many of our teachers, relatively higher percentage of our teachers had concerns. Is there more we can do to deep further down to see what specific concerns?
So in looking at the data, one of the things we've really worked with the district is, because we can get down to the school level, a question we did not present on here was, we ask about professional development needs within the building. So not only did we say, in which of these areas did you have 10 plus hours? We asked, in which of these areas do you need additional support to accelerate student learning? Okay? So one of the things we've really worked in unpacking the data and with our tools and some of the conversations, I keep going back to that last slide because we've done so much work since over the past month with principals and with school improvement teams, et cetera, is to say, start to look at those. It's a big difference to say 40%, roughly 39.4, of teachers say they have had 10 plus hours in classroom management techniques, if 80% of your faculty said they needed additional training in classroom management techniques to be successful, than if 20% did. So we think there are other data points within the survey that will be helpful to the school to really look. And in the end, what we're all trying to do is make sure we meet teachers where they are at to give them the support they need to reach all kids to accelerate their practice. And so making sure we differentiate, and Fairfax did look good compared to many other districts in saying, is professional development differentiated to meet the needs of individual teachers? But that was still an area that was lower than many of these other professional development.
Okay. Thank you so much.
We looked at.
Ted, Megan, then Ryan.
So first I just want to just verify that I heard that at the school campus level, we are using this information, right? We have trends, and the cluster assistant superintendents and the principals are actively working on all of that.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, we've been spending a lot of time. In fact, I've been in a number of meetings where it's drilling down at the school level. But I want to emphasize a point that was made is, Eric pointed out earlier, they've been having training, and the schools are bringing teams in, not just the principal, but teacher leaders. And I think you've had over 300 and something, I don't know how many schools that is, but we've been
close to 400.
Doing exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Excellent. So I won't accuse you of being a statistician, but I will ask some statistical questions.
My favorite.
So it would be my hypothesis that at a national level, perhaps at any level, that there's going to be some kind of correlation between the socioeconomic conditions in the school and the workplace conditions, the workplace satisfaction. So first of all, would you say that that's true based on just the national data? I'm making that hypothesis because I figure there are some kinds of schools, and I love Baltimore, but it's probably harder to teach in certain schools in Baltimore than perhaps some of the schools here in Fairfax County. And so teachers are up against a lot more stuff, right?
It's such a great question. And I think, so nationally, we have found this plays out differently across districts and states and differently within our construct. So generally, there is a correlation between the poverty rates of students served and whether conditions are in place. That is very strong in the areas, for example, of community engagement and support and managing student conduct. It is quite weak in the area of school leadership and teacher leadership, as you might hypothesize. So for example, when we looked, don't assume Montgomery County has better results than Baltimore City, Baltimore County, or Prince George's. In fact, on some of the teacher leadership indicators, Montgomery County, despite its low response rate, we actually found some of the lower percentages agreements in those areas. So I think it is, your hypothesis is generally right. It does vary a bit by construct, and ultimately, we haven't downloaded free and reduced lunch count yet for here, but I think that is on our research agenda for the summer to really look within Fairfax a little bit and see what those correlations are within this district.
So you're not a statistician, but you're a mind reader. Because I was going to be curious, actually, about seeing that chart within Fairfax County. And again, it's always interesting to see where the outliers are against that correlation, because you can find in what you may regard as a wealthy school that things don't look so good. So what's that telling you? Whereas the overall score might be, you understand my point. So I'll move on.
And we will run those. I think that idea was had by your brilliant staff as well. So we have our summer research cut out for us.
And you have noticed that they are brilliant. So one of the surprises I had on the Fruit Loop chart was the preponderance of elementary schools above the line and the high schools below the line. Because if I had been making a hypothesis before this report, I would have thought that our morale problems are concentrated in elementary schools. So this actually refutes a common notion that I've had since before I was on the school board. So this is extremely helpful in, I have to ingest some new data and make some new understandings here. My one question would be, so this goes back to comparing with other districts. Is this consistent with the national data? In other words, are you more likely nationally in any district to find that high schools are going to be more on trending below the average and the elementary schools trending above? Yeah.
Absolutely, in 7 out of 8 constructs. The one area where we see it completely flip is around time and workload. So ultimately, because so many of our time questions are related to planning time, collaborative time, and you can imagine the structures of the schedule and the calendar are different at the elementary and secondary level. So back to your point, I think then it would come in, are all 8 of these as important to morale and how teachers act? Is one more important than the other, right? So would you trade, in a hypothetical manner, your extra copy paper for an additional 5 minutes? And these are the calculus we know that a teacher, for their own efficacy and their own job satisfaction within the school, they all have their own calculus. We do ask them which of these conditions matter most to you for staying at your school and for accelerating teacher effectiveness. So we ask that question, but we don't say, we smushed 8 of these together, If time matters more to you than anything else because you are that pressed, then your SpaghettiOs may flip. No, just time. So 7 out of 8 high schools tend to have the least positive conditions on average. Middle schools are always in the middle, and elementaries have more positive conditions generally.
I have Megan, then Ryan, then Janie.
I wish I shared the enthusiasm of my colleagues on how this work session is going. I think, once again, there may be really great information that you've all been able to pull for us. And unfortunately, we're just not getting it today. And what I mean by that is, another way of drawing the analogy, in Fairfax County, we have some of the highest graduation rates in Virginia. We have some of the highest SATs. We have some of the highest AP test scores. Does that mean we're good to go? No, because we know when we look at it and disaggregate the data, we have 3-4 times the rates of our African American and Hispanic students not graduating on time. We have huge gaps in our AP test scores in terms of who passes and who fails among underrepresented minority students. And we look at our SAT scores and they're not the same across our 25 high schools. It's just an example of saying that I felt like we've spent way too much time today on here we are as a system. And I think we were all in agreement even before we came into this work session that we know we have some amazing schools, without question. And as a board, in order for us to work with and support the superintendent, I would have been far more pleased if we'd had the discussion of, here's a 5-minute overview, countywide, we don't really see a lot of red flags except for a few things here, time, school leadership. But, let's look at where we are identifying some issues. And, maybe I'm missing something here that the sensitivity was, we don't want to put those schools up there and, have them be a visual in a public work session. But everybody keeps referencing this chart, and I feel like as a board member, where the dialogue should have been is, what's going on here that helps us, because we hear it, people saying there's problems, and why. Then so that's one piece of it where I felt like I didn't need to spend any time about everything above the line. That's great. That's exciting news, and that's the first 5 minutes. But the hard work, the rolling up our sleeves is what's happening over here. And I'm leaving the work session. I feel like, honestly, I have no idea why that looks like that there. I do understand that the superintendent is dedicated and her team is dedicated to addressing that, but I don't feel as a board member unless I go to the working conditions survey site that you sent us the link. But then I've got to go into every single cluster and then try to find the school, and it's like finding the needle in the haystack. So it would have been helpful, I think, for me, because right now I have schools across multiple clusters. I don't even know, other than if a cluster superintendent's called me, here's the hot spots in each of our schools. So I don't feel any more informed about where and how that relates to the schools that I feel a responsibility to. And that I guess I'm trying to figure out how come we didn't get it presented to that, so we could have understood, especially those of us, there's 9 of us that are district board members. Our at-larges represent the entire district, but it would have been more helpful to kind of understand where this is.
Please.
First of all, I think you're going to go into some highlights of what we've been doing. I don't know, into your second PowerPoint of some of the things that we've been doing with individual schools, or we can do that another time. But I don't know if you were out of the room earlier when we said we're scheduling another one of these sessions to delve in more deeply with some of the work that we're doing specifically with some schools. And furthermore, we need to look at our master schedule at the elementary level. So moving forward, I think the chairman indicated that he's going to work with us to schedule another meeting to delve in more deeply in the next couple of weeks. So we'll talk about it there. I will tell you, I'd be always hesitant to put up a list of schools any kind of data we have as a system, it helps us take that data back. We have great people throughout the system that are responsible on a day in and day out basis to support and help our schools improve. I don't think we improve if we put them on the screen and would say, hey, public, this is what, we found some problems with these schools and we don't like this, because they can't see the whole picture. And we have a responsibility for the conversation to be productive and meaningful. It's just like at the campus level. If you were to visit with a principal, that principal's not going to tell you, you know what? These are the 5 teachers that I've got on a growth plan, and I'm working on them, and I put them on a chart, and I want the public to know who they are. But they're responsible. We don't do that. But they are responsible for working with those 5 teachers to helping them get better. So part of this is, I recognize there's an expectation. There's some people that, would like us to do that. I find that would be problematic. So that's why we tend to work offline, work with our schools, because this is just one, as Eric said, this is just one piece of the puzzle. There's lots of things that are different. In fact, you can take any one of these schools, and there's been, in some cases, some changing conditions, right? Maybe in January, and since that time, we've had a change in leadership. We may have had, change in leadership in the fall. I mean, there's just so many different things that you have to dig in a little bit more deeply and look at other things like the student performance data. It's one piece of the overall puzzle. So
that's very helpful. I do understand that, and I do understand the importance of sensitivity and not wanting to necessarily put neon lights. Here's the ones that are a problem. That said, this chart, you could easily have put this into some sort of graph that basically said, of your 200 schools, here's the ones that fell above the line, and how they broke out by elementary, middle, and high school. So in other words, I have to sit there and start counting along to this thing to see where are the problem schools.
So I will leave it to you, Phyllis, and you, Dr. Garza, that we have worked intensively with the cluster area superintendents to dashboard this data and work with them in an improvement mindset, and they have all the data and dashboarding that you all...
I really appreciate what you're saying. It's not that there's a shortage of data, but at our job, we're asked not to go down to the, the weeds, stay up here. I can't even stay up here because it's not in front of me to even look at it at the macro level. As Mr. Velkoff said, I can look at the colored circles and kind of get a general idea, but imagine if I just had a bar graph that said, of your high schools, X number are above the line, and there's the number, and here the below the line, and in 5 seconds, my brain would already be able to process.
That's very helpful feedback for us.
Yeah, because, and we want your work to be meaningful, because you've done a lot of work, but in the end, as a board, our employees are coming to us and saying, we ultimately hold you and the superintendent accountable for our working conditions, and I feel it's a little hard to be knowledgeable when...
We'll work on that, Ms. McLaughlin, to get you something that's a little bit more in a report format, maybe by district or something. We'll see what we can provide that's more explicit. I guess is that is what you're asking for.
I guess so. I'm just saying, even if we had just something that showed by the system of the 200 schools, by middle, elementary, and high school, which ones were above the line, which ones were below the line, and then right then and there, at least you can start to understand where there's an issue. And then I think it would be helpful if our cluster superintendents, all 8 of them, decided in what way that you feel is appropriate to communicate with the school board members and say, here's the ones that fell below the line, and here's the ones that we're trying to work on, because that would help us, because right now I feel completely in the dark. And there's only one cluster superintendent that called me and said, hey, I've got some numbers on one particular school. That's it. Yeah, I've just got one out of like 30 schools. But I don't know that. There might actually be other schools. That's just the one person who called me. So we're kind of incumbent on that. I do want to just at least emphasize that when I look at these numbers, again, I think what's very telling to me is in certain areas you can see something like 96% of our faculty feel they work in a school environment that's safe. That's outstanding. I mean, 96% talk about finding, a everyone feeling pretty good about in terms of safety. And then obviously we saw ones that were at some of the lowest points. The reduction of the amount of routine administrative paperwork at 64%. So whereas you provide us with the differences, and that's always important, I think, probably more for at the operations level. As a board member, the ones that were catching my eye were anything that was falling really below 80% starts to me be a red flag when you're talking about more than one in five feel concerned about something. And so, Dr. Garza, that's what I would say. Things like the leadership, managing student conduct, the use of time in school, teachers protected from duties that interfere with their essential role. Those areas that fell below 80%, I think, again, we know that when you disaggregate it out, there could be some schools that it's 85% or more feel very positive in these areas I'm pulling out. And that's why I think in the end, disaggregating by school is so important. But it is interesting to see the general themes where you sometimes see more broadly that there are areas of concern. And then I guess I would just say that, when you looked at that chart on page, I think it's 16, whereas teacher working condition makes a difference to future employment plans, stayers and movers. I was just wondering, is there a reason it didn't actually break out what the percent of those total respondents were? So we know that if you're a stayer, 82% of you felt that way, versus if you were a mover, only 37% agreed to it. But what were they in the overall percentage of the total respondents?
Right. Which, and again, 82% of your teachers who responded were stayers, which is another thing to celebrate. So we can certainly provide that data to the district to provide to you in a few different ways. And a lot of the data you're requesting, for example, any question that's under 80% by school sortable, we've provided that data to the district. So we will certainly work with Beth and Phyllis to array the data and make sure at least you have what you need from us to make sure the board is ready to do their good work.
Yeah, so I mean, again, just I guess to our meeting managers and my colleagues on the board, I hope we can figure out a meaningful way to have that discussion of, even if we're not naming school by school, but looking at, as Mr. Velkoff pointed out, are we seeing some red flags more in our high schools or our middle schools or elementary? Is it clustering around certain areas within each of the schools where the dynamic is? So trying to be appropriate in our governance.
So here's what I'm hearing from that, and I think this is the hard part for when the board gets his presentation. There's the place where the work really gets done to make the changes, and that's the school level with the schools working with the cluster assistant superintendent. But then there's also the question that gets begged for the board: are there policy changes we need to make to affect any of this? Because really, the school-to-school work isn't board work. That's staff work. And maybe that's the piece as we do stuff like this. We need some guidance from the superintendent. Is there anything policy that the board should be looking at?
Well, I guess I would, I'll move on to let somebody else have their time, but I would slightly disagree in that. We do set policy, and so that's where you and I are both in agreement on that, and it's very important. But we're also elected to be stewards of the school system. And if we have working condition problems, then again, working with our superintendent, who is new to the system after, she's new coming in. And so she's now trying to continue to improve the working conditions in our school system. And she can't fix everything in less than a year's time. But we do have a responsibility to understand the working condition of the school system. It's not just about setting policy. It's working and supporting her as she's trying to address our employee concerns. There's 24,000 employees in this school system, and if they're expressing concern, then we're supposed to be knowledgeable and support the superintendent and the cluster. But if we're not knowledgeable and we don't understand where the problems are, then I think we're missing the governance and the stewardship side of our job.
Karen?
With regard to the policy issues, that's why I was referring to an additional session. As I'm glad Ted Velkoff was asking the questions regarding some of the major themes. We know that professional development is one where we may need to be more concise and clear about the purpose. I think we have some great professional development, but I think it maybe in some cases it needs to be either more focused or more differentiated. I think those are some things that we've learned. But the third, I think the most important thing is time at the elementary level. That was, I think, a big, takeaway, and it's certainly something I've heard all year long with the issue of time, and that may be a policy resource challenge that we have to figure out over the next couple of weeks or so moving forward. So I think that, to your point, Kathy, I think that's one of the big takeaways, something that we really need to work on.
Thank you. I have Ryan, Janie, and Pat.
So very briefly, I would agree with Mr. Velkoff that, my impression has always been that elementary schools are where we have the biggest problem. And I think when we sat down and discussed this, that it was surprising to see that, high school is where there's a big issue potentially. But my question is actually on professional development, which is clearly a very big issue for us. In working with other districts, have you seen that as a phenomenon, or have you seen best practice districts where they've done good improvement in that area?
We have, and a lot of it is school to school. I think the biggest challenge that is identified by our survey is whether or not professional development, which is so often delivered at a district level due to economies of scales and costs, is really differentiated down to help an individual teacher and where their needs are to improve their practice for reaching all students. And our data here, as well as in other districts, has unpacked, it's often with the students in which you need to differentiate instruction the most to meet them, be it gifted, be it someone on an IEP, et cetera. And so ultimately where we found the greatest success are folks who do bring that professional development down, not necessarily in its delivery, but really ensuring that the offerings and the support are truly tailored and customized to the individual needs of teachers based on the school improvement plan and their individual growth plan of their evaluation. So I think the takeaway from here, and I know how much PLA has been doing in the district and how much the district has looked within this, is I think this data uncovers, we've seen teachers saying they're having a little less role in what offerings are available, and it's really making sure that the opportunities sync with the areas that will really help Fairfax teachers meet the needs of the students they teach.
So could you name any model districts in that area, or just?
Sure. So again, one of the areas where you did see results in which the comparisons were different is in Tampa, and in part, Tampa has had a Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation deep dive grant that has showered them with resources to address some of the formative pieces, some of the professional development delivery, and the syncing of evaluation and individual teacher need with some of the professional development systems. We, for example, are working with them right now under a federal seed grant where we're working with full-time release mentors in addition to coaches, coaching principals. There are some support apparati that I think have really helped, and that is a good model.
And maybe this is for Phyllis, but how do we get showered with those kind of resources?
That is just not a question for Phyllis.
Wait, should I close my apple?
Exactly. I've got my galoshes ready to be showered with any type of resources in that area. And we certainly have pursued, and I know we continue to pursue grants at a large scale for our division. The Gates grants being one of them. We spent a lot of time and a lot of energy around some significant grant application that would have brought resources to the division to be able to provide staff and time. I mean, to have full-time release mentors where we have mentors who work by day in the classroom, and then we provide them a stipend where they do a little something extra. I mean, that's a big difference in the gift of time.
Well, it's good to know we're applying for those things, so thank you.
Janie, Pat, then Dan.
First of all, thank you very much. I appreciate my colleagues' questions, and Mr. Moon and Mr. Velkovs in particular, because you asked them the same questions. So, shortens my time. Just for a little bit of background, some years ago when we decided to go down this path, it was with the agreement that individual data for schools would be used not only for us broadly, but that it would go back to individual schools so they could have an opportunity to become better. And the promise was this would not be a gotcha. Having said that, I am looking at some of the individual data. And I am fascinated by the time issue for elementary school, because that was one of the things that we've been hearing and are very concerned about, and we'll need to figure out a better way to support our teachers. They need specific help with specific kids. Their plate is so full, period, just because of standards and everything else that we have to do, that they value their time and their time in the classroom with their children. So they want high value time with the individual children that they have. So clearly, and I'm actually looking at it in detail, that's exactly what I see. So thank you very much. It's excellent.
Thank you, Janie. Pat, then Dan.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm sorry I was running late and I missed your presentation. I'm teaching out in Loudoun County.
It was fantastic.
I'm
from what
sure.
I've heard.
I saw all the smiles when I walked in. But, one of the working conditions for teachers is that you can't leave the building until the buses drive away. So that's why I was late today. But I just had a couple questions. I did take a look at the presentation. Thank you. And I think it's a really great wealth of data for us to work with. Thank you. The question of, what we do with individual schools, I mean, I am of the mind that it's not appropriate for public consumption to have, the individual schools listed. But I just want to make sure I understand if there is an issue at one of my schools, I would find that out by talking to cluster directors. Yeah, okay. All right, and okay, great. That's helpful. The time and workload issue, that's the red flag. I feel like when we look at all this other stuff, there are no other consistent issues, across the county. And I understand that we'll be talking about that a little bit today, so I'll save my questions for how we're responding to that. My last question was on professional development. Just wondering, I guess this is for Dr. Garza, do you feel like the data that we've gotten through this on professional development is helpful to you going forward as you make changes in professional development? Do you think we need, more information?
I think we certainly have collected a lot of information about perceptions and how people feel about professional development. I think to some extent it goes back to what I said earlier about communication. I think we offer a lot of great professional development. And maybe from a division perspective, it's maybe not focused enough in terms of what we're articulating are our priorities around professional development. I think we've also learned that I think our teachers want more differentiated, to meet their needs. I think you articulated that very well in your last answer. We are doing a lot of things where we're designing it at the division level and then deploying it at the campus level. And I think they want it to be a little bit more differentiated. I think there's some things we can do with that. But I think with this survey, as with anything, if we identify some areas that we want to explore further, I think that gives us an opportunity to put together focus groups, stakeholder groups, and delve in a little bit more deeply. And I'm sure you have examples where school systems have done that. So I think there's some learning that we can do. We can pull together some stakeholder groups and do that.
Okay, thank you.
Patty?
Thank you. This is a very interesting presentation. I think you can see we're all very engaged and wish we had even more time to get into all kinds of discussions. But I'm trying to really focus on a few. And one is, what is the message that you think we should be giving our employees who have taken the time, every other year to provide this input? In particular, as we talk about, well, there's the outliers, and then there's the ones who have not really made any changes. I mean, what kind of, and maybe this is a question more for the superintendent than for you all, but I'm very curious, just so that we can send a message to our employees. We're going to use this data, in what way, Can you talk a little bit about that?
That's part of the training that Eric and his team have provided for us. But we've been coaching principals on how to take this information with a team of teachers, with a team of their teacher leaders, and go back and present it to the entire faculty, and then use teams to identify some areas that they want to improve. So we are working with individual campuses and helping them go back and share the data at the individual campus level, because that's where it's really meaningful, right? Let's look at our results from one year to the next. What are our areas where we need to pat ourselves on the back? Because we do have a lot of schools that I noticed specifically that made huge gains, and that's an opportunity for celebration. But at the same time, then how would they identify some areas that they want to improve? How do they fold that into their school improvement planning process? So that's what we're doing right now through the cluster assistant superintendents is really, and of course through this effort, and using this as part of the improvement process. So that's going on right now.
And I do think with the survey, we very much focus on the weather. Weather conditions are available, not the why. And the why is really what happens through great dialogue at the school level. We've held up a mirror, and what you all see in the mirror may be very different. The way you're going to norm and really drill down to root causes to discuss those. So I think the district has done a great job trying to get those tools and some building the capacity of schools to have those often it's hard to talk about what you see in the mirror, to have those conversations. So I think that has worked well. I think the other thing the district is doing, and we're starting tomorrow, is really trying to get clear around the district's expectations for what are a minimal set or a minimal standard of conditions that would allow teachers to thrive. So we're going to work on creating district standards in which we can get beyond 75, 68, 47% and say, what does a school look, feel, smell, hear? What is present in a school when we have addressed some of these workload or time issues? What are present to try to really create that benchmark in a way for schools to learn from.
Thank you. And one more question, and that's kind of going up to the 10,000-foot level and asking you why this data is important. In other words, what relationship does this data have to other things such as turnover, grievances, even student achievement? Are there any, not causation, but any correlations, anything that you see in terms of relationships from a board perspective that should grab our attention?
Absolutely. On the first slide, it matters for kids. Ultimately, we find teachers can do a better job. They are more effective in schools with more positive conditions. We've seen that from external researchers that looked at professional growth of teachers in schools with great conditions, and we've seen it in our own work as part of the Bill and Melinda Gates Measures of Effective Teaching initiative. We know it matters for keeping teachers. Every piece of research says what matters most for keeping a teacher in a school is school leadership and some of these empowerment and support structures that are there. And ultimately, one of the key areas, and something we haven't discussed much, is again, that these things not only matter for keeping teachers and for student success, but everybody in the school sees these potentially differently based on where you sit. So again, coming together and giving these schools the tools to have the conversation are what drives improvement on this indicator, which we see makes a difference for whether or not teachers want to stay at their school.
And the last point I'll make is just to say the word autonomy, and that's something that we've heard from teachers for years. And I don't want that to be lost as we talk about some of these other fixes. To me, that's still something that we've got to be better at addressing.
Thank you. I appreciate the presentation and the thoroughness of your answers. It is better to have a dialogue to understand some of it. I do have a request. I know there were two slides that we noted needed a change. One was slide 12, which should see professional development, and the other was on slide 15. If we could have the presentation changed and reposted with those changes, I think that would be beneficial.
Sure will, and my apologies.
Okay. No, it's okay. Elizabeth, did you have a quick go back?
Just two quick things. On the, and this is more for Dr. Garza, the information on the dissemination of the working class. That was really not what I meant to say. Working conditions survey. It seems like the dissemination of the information was at the discretion of the clusters, and some I got very proactive, here's all your schools with all the drill down information, and then others, they were like, well, we don't know if we're supposed to distribute that. And it was a very mixed bag of either me having to proactively procure the data versus it being proactively provided. And I can provide you offline, how and where that occurred. So a consistent delivery, I think, of the information to the board members. And then with regard to this, and I tried to check with DCCO, and we came up, I think, maybe with a word, infographic on learning. Is the presentation of the information in a way that it's meaningful, maybe a little bit, a couple of my fellow board members were getting to it, on what are you trying to get us to pay attention to, as opposed to a bar graph and a chart, and the infographic of what's the key information that you're trying to convey, as opposed to all of it kind of boiled down at a top level. Is there are some things that you want us to pay attention to, clearly. And so that's just a suggestion going forward, not for this, but infographics. Truly do appreciate the feedback. We are here for you and your learning. And so tremendously helpful. We tried to pull, again, the time, the professional development, and some of the real positives about school leadership as takeaways, and not to lose the school picture within the district. So we will certainly work as we work with the district throughout the summer and throughout the next calendar year to make sure, as we develop these standards and continue to roll out, that we can get that information in a more usable format. I think we've nailed it in terms of dashboards with schools and at clusters. And I think as we try to, again, level up and truly learn and appreciate the board's role, I think we can try to do better for you. So we'll do our best.
Megan?
Just to follow up with what Ms. Schultz shared, and this is really, I guess, more for Dr. Garza for our next steps. I think it's always important to have context in order to understand results. So because, as Ms. Schultz pointed out, we really didn't consistently, as a board, get the information from our cluster superintendents on which schools were falling below that line. And as I mentioned, that Fruit Loop graph that everybody keeps talking about, it would be really helpful. Again, we don't have to name out the schools, but saying, X number of elementary, X number of middle, X number of high fell under there. And then, by cluster, here's where the schools were. And then, because that way, it's not only that I'll understand what's happening in the clusters I represent, but it also helps me in the context of the division itself. Where we're at. I just think that's it's important because otherwise we have no idea if we only go on some of these percentages, but again, it only comes out there at the highest level.
Okay. I'm not sure about any next steps. I didn't find any except for specific information to get data in different ways. And some of it, I think, is going to be data individually that board members get from their clusters. There's going to be another work session scheduled with the chairman. So that's the piece I gathered. So I want to thank you for all your hard work.
Mrs. Smith?
Yes, Chairman Moon.
Since you talk about scheduling another work session, putting all my colleagues on the notice that to put a hold for May 28th, Wednesday, probably about 4 o'clock and on. I have cleared that with Dr. Garza and Madam Clerk. May 28th.
Okay, so I would ask the clerk of the board to send an email to the board members about putting a hold on May 28th for a follow-up work session. Okay.
4 o'clock and on.
4 o'clock. Oh, yeah. Okay, so
4 p.m.
This work session is adjourned. We're going to take a 5-minute before we start with the SR&R discussion so people can move around and run down the hallway. Thank you.